Let me tell you a story from May of last year. I had just started university and was slowly making friends. One Saturday night, I got a call from a guy I'd become close with at sushi. He told me our mutual friends, Beniro and Satoshi, were over at his place and invited me to join them. It was already 9 p.m. Atsushi lived on the other side of town. I'd have to cross the university campus and take a train with several transfers. It was a hassle, but it was a boring Saturday night, so I figured, why not? While waiting on the transfer platform, I noticed something off. The station was eerily quiet. Is it always this empty on a Saturday? I wondered, but I brushed it off and stepped into the carriage. Inside, it was just as desolate. Only two drunk men sat a few seats away. I slumped into my seat, buried my face in my phone, and drifted into my own thoughts. At the next stop, the drunk pair got off. In their place, a girl stepped in. She looked about my age and sat down directly across from me. I didn't look up at first, but when I finally did, I froze. She was incredibly beautiful. Mid-length black hair, a modest, calm demeanor. Honestly, she was exactly my type. I wasn't great with girls. In fact, I'd been single for every year of my life, so I didn't have the courage to say a word. Meetings like this don't just happen, I thought, unable to look away. And then inevitably, our eyes met. Panic hit me. Great, now she thinks I'm a creep. I snapped my head toward the window, pretending to be fascinated by the dark landscape, but I was twitching with nerves. There were 5 stops left. I debated getting off early just to escape the awkwardness. Then I heard a soft giggle. Did you want something? She asked playfully. I was stunned. It felt like a scene out of a manga. Inside, I was cheering. Outwardly, I tried to play it cool. No, I was just looking out the window. She giggled again. Come on, you were looking at me. To my absolute delight, she stood up and sat down right next to me. I gave in and admitted it. Yeah, sorry, I was. The next 15 minutes flew by. We talked. Her name was Akimi-chan. She said she went to the same university as me, just in a different department. At the time, I didn't notice the red flags. But looking back, her behavior was wrong. One moment she'd talk about current news, and the next, she'd recount events from decades ago. When I mentioned the recent earthquake, she barely reacted. Sometimes she'd repeat the same phrase over and over, then suddenly go silent, her face turning completely blank. I was blinded by her beauty. I see now that her knowledge wasn't lived experience. It was a collection of information she'd gathered secondhand. There was an artificiality to her words that I can't quite describe, but there was one thing that bothered me even then. Every time the train swayed, there was a sound. A dry, light clicking. Like 2 pieces of hard plastic knocking together. I looked around for the source, but found nothing. When we reached the stop before mine, Akumi's phone rang. She opened her bag to grab it, and I caught a glimpse inside. My brain momentarily short-circuited. Inside that bag were 2 massive, rusted Chinese cleavers. Unlike a standard kitchen knife, these are heavy, rectangular blades. They are often associated with slasher archetypes because of how much force they carry. They didn't fit her image at all. Who carries those every day? It was beyond strange. She closed the bag instantly, but I knew what I saw, and all the while, that clicking continued. I snapped out of my trance. Why would a girl like that just start talking to a stranger? It wasn't a gift from fate. She was dangerous. I realized that if I got off at my station with her, I was dead. I decided to wait until the very last second. The train stopped. Akimi was still on the phone, but she kept glancing at me. Every time we locked eyes, a chill ran down my spine. Finally, the departure melody played. Sorry, I gotta go! I lunged out of the door just as they hissed shut. She didn't have time to react. The train pulled away. I stood on the platform, gasping for air. But I wasn't home yet. I'd only lived in this city for 2 months and had no idea how to walk to Atsushi's from this station. Waiting for the next train felt too risky. What if she was waiting at the next stop? I called Atsushi, got his address, and hailed a taxi. Spending an extra 1,000 yen was a small price to pay to avoid a Kimi. When I reached Atsushi's, I burst through the door. Guys, you won't believe it! I just ran into a complete psychopath. I told my 3 friends everything. They laughed it off. You're full of it, Satoshi yelled. And at that exact moment, the doorbell rang. It was nearly 11 p.m. No one was expected. A heavy silence fell over the room. Beniro joked, Hey, maybe it's a Kimi-chan? I went pale. Atsushi, seeing my face, crept to the door and looked through the peephole. He backed away, whispering, There's a gorgeous girl out there. She's smiling right at the door. The bell rang again. And again. I had to see for myself. I looked through the peephole. It was her. But she was standing there with an expression that looked puzzled. We had an emergency meeting in whispers. We couldn't pretend we weren't home. The lights were on and we'd been shouting. I suggested hiding in the closet while Atsushi told her he didn't know me, but she was armed. Opening the door was madness. Then her voice came through the wood. You're in there, aren't you? I saw you go in. Why are you running away? That's so mean. Come out and talk to me. Atsushi was shaking. How did she find you? You took a taxi. Suddenly, a horrific sound erupted from the door. Atsushi looked through the peephole again and recoiled. She's scratching the door with a cleaver. She's insane. Akemi kept calling my name in a sweet, gentle voice, punctuated by the screeching of metal on metal. Finally, a neighbor lost his temper and yelled through the wall for us to shut up. Silence. Then, whoa! What the? The neighbor's door slammed shut. Then, the screeching started again. Just as things reached a breaking point, blue and red lights flashed outside the window. Someone had called the police. We heard a shout of, "Halt!" and the sound of running feet. Then, silence. The police knocked. They told us that when they confronted her, she pushed past them, sprinted to the end of the hall, jumped over a fence, and vanished. They couldn't find her. I gave them her description and told them she supposedly went to my school. The neighbor told us that when he'd yelled at her, she'd turned and started swinging the cleavers at him without a word. Later, we found out there was no girl by that name at the university. The police couldn't find a single record of her existence. A month passed. The patrols stopped. I started to relax. That was my fatal mistake. Late one night, I got hungry and walked to the convenience store by the station. It was 11 p.m. When I stepped outside, the streets were empty. It was exactly like that night in May. I was walking past a park when I saw a figure sitting on a bench. I couldn't see the face, but the figure stood up and cut me off. It was Akemi. She was beaming. We finally met! She was holding that same bag. My brain had a weird reaction. I actually thought, if she wasn't a killer, this would be a perfect moment. I had to run. She was wearing high-heeled sandals, not made for sprinting. I was in sneakers and used to play basketball. I bolted in the opposite direction of my house. I remembered the officer's words. I have your number. If you can't talk, just call and we'll send a car. I reached into my pockets. Empty. My phone was at home, on the charger. I wanted to scream. I ran for a kilometer. It was weird. I saw cars, but not a single pedestrian. I decided I'd lost her and stopped to breathe. Then I remembered. There was an old phone booth in the park. I crept back toward the park, checking every shadow. It was silent. I stepped into the booth, and just as I reached for the phone, Someone tapped me on the shoulder. I felt a wave of pure despair. I turned around. There was Akemi, smiling beautifully. I screamed like a child and collapsed. She just giggled. How? I yelled. How do you keep finding me? She laughed again. Because I am in your pocket. I always know where you are. She pointed to my back pocket. I reached in and felt something long and hard. A battery? I pulled it out. It was a human finger. I shrieked and threw it away. But it didn't feel like flesh. It felt like plastic. A mannequin's finger? Akemi picked it up, leaned down, and tucked it back into my pocket. She whispered in my ear, If you throw me away again, I'll kill you. I was paralyzed. Since we've met, let's go to your place, she said. She grabbed my arm and pulled me up. Now listen. I'm 175 centimeters tall, about 5 foot 9 inches, and 160 pounds. A girl should not be able to hoist me up with one hand. Her strength was inhuman. She dragged me toward my apartment. She knew the way. And there it was again. The sound came with every step she took. We got to my room. She started looking around, chirping about how messy boys' rooms are. I sat there, a prisoner in my own home. She started tidying up a stack of books, and her hair shifted, baring her neck. I saw it. A thin, dark line circled her entire throat. At the back, the seam was jagged. The edges didn't quite line up, and every time she moved, those edges rubbed together. It wasn't a seam from a surgery. It was a joint. I realized then that I wasn't dealing with a psychopath. I was dealing with something else entirely. What's wrong? She asked, turning around. It's embarrassing when you stare. She reached for a book on a high shelf, and a stack of heavy dictionaries fell, slamming onto her head. Bam! Oh dear, she mumbled. She turned to face me, and I nearly fainted. The impact had caused her head to slide sideways along the seam. Her face was no longer centered on her neck. She casually reached up, pushed her head back into place, and went back to cleaning. She wasn't human. I saw my phone on the charger. I tried to edge toward it, but without even looking, she said, "No phones allowed." She tossed it into her bag. My eyes landed on my electric kettle, full of boiling water. Fear turned into survival instinct. I grabbed the handle and smashed it over her head with a scream. She flew against the wall. I waited for her to die, but she just started standing back up. That hurt. Why did you do that? She said in a whiny, pouting voice, but only the bottom half of her face was talking. The top half, from the nose up, had broken off and was lying on the floor. Her eye sockets were hollow, empty. I threw the kettle at her and sprinted out the door. I looked back at my second-story window. Akemi was standing there. In one hand, a cleaver. In the other, the top half of her own head. She jumped. I ran until my lungs burned. Behind me, getting fainter but never stopping, was that sound. I remembered. If you throw me away, I'll kill you. The finger! The beacon! I reached a main road and saw the torii gate of an old shrine. I don't know why, but I ran for it. I sprinted under the gate, ripped the plastic finger from my pocket, and hurled it as deep into the shrine grounds as I could. At that exact second, I heard the screech of tires and a sickening thud on the road. I walked back. A car had stopped. The driver was on his phone, hysterical. I just hit someone, but they're gone. I looked at the asphalt. There were no bodies, just fragments. Pieces of a doll. The clothes were identical to Akemi's, but it was a cheap, primitive doll. No hinges, no clockwork. How it moved, nobody knows. The police took the fragments. They later told me that the phone Akemi had been using was a number that had been disconnected and the hardware destroyed years ago. It couldn't have received a call. I haven't seen her since. But I am terrified of empty streets. I try not to think about that doll too much. I'm afraid that if I imagine her too clearly, she'll come back.